Love it, hate it. Everybody's got an opinion about the Falcons draft. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $250 in bonus bets when your first $5 bets wins. So if you don't know me, I'm your humble host, Sirius Black. Or no, my actual name is Aaron Freeman, aka Sirius Black. You know, Mama called me Aaron. Everybody should call me Aaron, but you know, some people call me Sirius. Been covering the Atlanta Falcons. We're off to a great start today. For almost 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com, RMP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I think each and every one of you that goes strong with me each and every day, that makes you an everydayer. Okay, that makes this podcast your first listen each and every day. And to become an everydayer, all you got to do, guys, is subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. So today's episode, we are talking all about the position of need left to fill after the draft, the undrafted free agent that everybody has their eye on, a favorite and least favorite of the Falcons draft picks, and why is everybody so upset about the Atlanta Falcons trading away future draft picks. But we're getting into this because I sent out a little poll Monday morning to the Locked On Falcons Insiders, link in description below if you want to join, where you can get access to these, you know, special polls. Pause. You can also, you know, get questions and insight. Also, you get film breakdowns and whatnot of the Falcons' various draft picks. And so 14-day free trial, $4.99 a month thereafter. But sent these guys a poll and had 7 real questions on them. The first one, what were your overall thoughts on the Falcons draft? Who was your favorite pick? Who was your least favorite pick? Who you think is an underrated pick? What are your thoughts on the Falcons trading away 2026 draft picks? Who's your favorite undrafted free agent that the Falcons signed? And was there a position that you felt like the Falcons didn't address that they needed to address? And what was it? And so let's get into the Locked On Falcons Insiders overall thoughts on it. About half of the Locked On Falcons Insiders responded to this poll as of this recording. So we're going to base those numbers off of that. The rest of you are insiders, you know, how dare you? But, you know, that first question for what are your overall thoughts on the Falcons draft? There were 5 potential responses. Loved it, liked it, it's okay. The jury's still out, or hated it, right? And 50% loved it of the Locked On Falcons Insiders. 39% liked it. 4% was like, it's okay. And about 6.5% said the jury is still out. So basically, if you just look at loved it and liked it, there's almost 90% approval rating amongst the Locked On Falcons Insiders when it came to the Falcons draft. And, you know, that gets us to the conversation about draft grades, which, you know, I wasn't really planning on talking about draft grades on this podcast, but might as well get into it. Let's get it over with now, right? Because I had one of the insiders ask me the other day, do you have a theory why the Falcons draft is being almost universally hated by the media? Is it just the trade up? And this was from Kyle S. And, you know, Kyle, my response is I don't think it's universal. The majority of grades I've seen are just kind of average grades for the Falcons. There are some people that do hate it. I would say overall, compared to most other NFL teams, the Falcons grade is below average. But at the same time, I feel like the way that grades kind of work nowadays is a little different. More on that later. So let's get into what grades the Falcons are getting. And I'm gleaning this from, I think his name is Rene Bounier's composite grades. He posted like 24 different draft grades for every NFL team. A lot of the main websites that you would find, a lot of other ones that you wouldn't. And the Falcons on the composite grade, you know, ranked 26th in the NFL out of the 32 teams. They had a GPA, grade point average, averaging those A's, B's, C's, D's, and F's of 2.6. So not great. Basically, a high C, right? Is that? It's been so long since I've been in school that I don't remember what GPAs. I thought threes were A's, and okay, yeah, whatever. It doesn't matter. Anyway, so of these 24, the Falcons got 3 A's, all A minuses. They had 12 B's, a healthy mix of B pluses, B's, and B minuses. 7 C's, again, pretty much spread across the board, and 2 D's. And it gets to the nature of what I think, particularly with draft grades nowadays, because mostly you see A, B's, and C's. Like a bunch of these websites that Renee had put together didn't really give out any D's. There was only a handful of D's handed out to various teams across the league, because most of the time nowadays people just give out A's, B's. If you like a draft, it's an A. If you're just kind of met on the draft, it's a B. And if you don't like a draft, you give it a C. Right? Because basically nowadays people that are doing draft grades don't want to have their grades screenshotted by fans 3 years down the road, be like, oh, you gave this draft an F and it turned out to be great. Like I remember, I want to say Charles McDonald, our friend over at Yahoo Sports, gave the Lions an F grade, I think in their 23 draft. And everybody's like, you're an idiot now, like those types of things. So basically people are soft with the grades now. So, Kyle, I don't know if it's universally bad, but it does feel like, reading some of the C's and D's that Renee had collected, it did feel like a lot of the criticisms around the Falcons draft was like, we like the players that they drafted, but we didn't like the trade up. So I think it is related to the trade up if people didn't like the Falcons draft. And we had Kevin Knight of the Falcoholic on the podcast defending the trade up on yesterday. So go listen to that episode if you missed it and you want to hear, a case for why the trade up is not as big a negative as some people portray it as. My stance is, I don't like the trade ups in the draft. I don't think it's indefensible or anything like that. But, given at least the perception as we sit here today, and we'll see how this ages, but I think the general perception seems to be that the 2026 draft class will probably be a strong draft class in the 2025 draft class, because the 2025 draft class was universally hailed as not being particularly strong at the top of the draft. And so that pendulum will probably swing back in the other direction, as it often does with the draft, where like 1 year you have a weak year, 1 year you have a strong year, followed by, that sort of thing. It doesn't really matter where the Falcons are picking, that even like based off of that argument, if 2026 is a stronger draft class, that even if they're picking in the 20s, they probably, based off of that, could get a better player in the 20s in 2026 than they would picking James Pearce in the 20s in 2025. That would be that argument. But we'll see. Again, we have like I think I said 50 years, but it's more accurately probably 30 years, because it hasn't been, 7-round mock draft for 50 years, or mock draft, 7-round real draft for 50 years. But we have like 30 years of data that basically tells us that trading up in the draft and trading away future picks is usually not a good strategy. And so that's basically all I have to couch my criticism of the trade up in. It's just like, history is on, is against Terry Fontenot. So we'll see if he can buck, the insurmountable odds of history when it comes to those trade ups. But, my stance on drafts are always like, it's water under the bridge at this point in time. So, we'll cross that bridge if and when we get to it down the road. So, speaking of the trade up, though, one of the questions I did ask was, what are your thoughts on the Falcons trading away 2026 draft picks? And the answers, there were 4 possible answers. I love it. Let Terry cook. I don't mind. That's Terry being Terry. This could come back to bite us, but it is what it is. This is basically my stance. And then 4 is I hated it, Terry. It's on site. And then, of course, 5 is other, if none of these 4 answers properly describe what you thought. And so the majority of people were like, about 41% said this could come back to bite us, but it is what it is. 28% said I don't mind it, Terry being Terry. 11% said I love it, let Terry cook. And about 4% said I hated it, Terry, it's on site. And about 15% said other. But it seemed like the majority of those people were somewhere between I don't mind it, mostly I don't mind it. So, if I was trying to categorize how people responded to the other by answering their own and sort of fit it into these broad categories, I would probably say it could come back to bite us is about 43, 44%. Terry being Terry, I don't mind it, is about 37%. I love it, 13%. And then I hate it is about 7%. So that's basically it breaking down. So I think people's opinions of it are mixed, but in general, they're not going to ding the Falcons for the trades, at least among the Locked On Falcons Insider. So, those are I think the general impressions of the Falcons draft. I think certainly among at least half of the Locked On Falcons Insiders tend to be more favorable, but a little bit of a more mixed opinion when it comes to that trade up situation, which is probably what is stopping some people from absolutely loving the draft. But let's talk about how the insiders feel about the individual picks and players, talk about some of their favorite, least favorite, and who is also underrated in this draft class as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So the NBA playoffs are here, and FanDuel is giving new customers an incredible way to get in on the action. Right now, when you join FanDuel, place your first $5 bet, you'll get $250 in bonus bets if your bet wins. And we love how FanDuel makes betting so easy, whether it's picking your favorite team or least favorite team to lose, favorite team to win, least favorite team to lose, diving in the player props like threes, steals, assists, or combining those player props into a same game parlay. Bet a little, win a lot. And it's not just the NBA playoffs. We got, horse racing coming up. We got, baseball going on. And of course, you can bet on some of these NFL futures if you're feeling particularly optimistic or pessimistic about the Falcons or any team's upcoming season. It's all available for you at FanDuel. So don't miss out. Head over to FanDuel.com and claim your $250 in bonus bets today. So I asked who of these 5 players was your favorite pick, and 63% said Jalen Walker, 20% said James Pearce, 13% said Xavier Watts, 2% said Billy Bowman, and 2% said Jack Nelson. Now I asked what was the Locked On Falcons' least favorite pick, and 51%, poor Jack Nelson, said Jack Nelson, right? Understandable, it's hard to get excited about Jack Nelson. 34%, however, did say James Pearce, 10% said Billy Bowman, 5% said Jalen Walker, and Xavier Watts had 0% on the least favorite pick. So about 10% of the respondents in this poll did abstain from voting for a least favorite pick. So I'm assuming those people are like, I'm not even going to put that negativity out there, Aaron, by saying my least favorite pick, because they're all my favorite picks or whatever that the case. So we did not get as many votes in the least favorite category as we got in the favorite category. Now I also asked, who do you think is underrated among the picks? And James Pearce won that with 35% of the vote. Xavier Watts was 28%. I also put in a caveat as everybody is properly rated for anybody who didn't have a strong feeling about anybody being underrated. And that also was about 28%. Billy Bowman was 6.5%. Jack Nelson was 2%. And Jalen Walker was 0%. Everybody feels like, I guess, Jalen Walker is properly rated, I guess, in addition to everybody else. And then I also asked, do you have a favorite undrafted free agent signing? And 69%, nice, of the Locked On Falcons insiders voted for Kobe Bryant, the cornerback out of Kansas. 22% picked Nick Nash, the wide receiver out of San Jose State. 9% picked Josh Gray, the offensive lineman from Oregon State. And those were the only people that got votes. I also put in, I think Josh Simon and other in the event, but nobody else decided to go away from those 3. And it's not a shock to me that Kobe Bryant overwhelmingly won that. I think he's widely considered to be the best of the undrafted free agents that the Falcons signed. And I also did a breakdown for him for the Locked On Falcons insiders, like, relatively fresh in their minds, probably like the Friday before the draft. Was it? Yeah, I think it was the Friday before the draft that I dropped that. And so they got to see Kobe Bryant. And, I'm sure some of those people came away thinking that he would make a lot of sense as a day 3 selection for the Atlanta Falcons. And, it's interesting when you look at a player like James Pearce, because, he was the second vote getter for favorite pick, and he was the second vote getter for least favorite pick. And so I think James Pearce, that's, a good indicator that something that I think we probably all would have guessed and suspected, that Pearce is probably going to be one of the more polarizing players in this Falcons draft class. Some of that is owed to the trade up. And so that's fueling some of the negativity towards James Pearce. I think the other stuff is, the off-field concerns with James Pearce, and I'm sure that will be something that we will get into much more in the coming days and weeks with various guests and myself sharing my thoughts on that. But, it is interesting that, a large percentage, more people said that he was their least favorite pick versus their favorite pick, but you also had a very high percentage of people saying that he's underrated. So he's going to be one of those players that I think fans are going to fight with each other about. You're going to love him or you're going to hate him, at least, going into his season, let alone what he does on the field. And people are going to have very strong opinions about how he performs on the field. And so he's going to be, to me, in that same category that a Kyle Pitts is, a Vic Beasley was. Tack McKinley eventually got there with those things. But, it's true pretty much any player at the Falcons draft. There are going to be people that love the player. There are going to be people that hate the player. Caleb McGarry is a very polarizing player for the Atlanta Falcons. There's very few players that have like universal adoration. It's like Chris Lindstrom, Mohamed Sanu, and that's about it. Right? Like that have over like 90% approval. Like even Julio Jones and Matt Ryan didn't have over 90% approval ratings. I don't think Grady Jarrett had over a 90% approval rating amongst fans. So, it's going to be interesting to watch the war, the people drawing their line, because people are going to take it very personal because, it's fandom and all that stuff. And so people are going to be very passionate about a player that we haven't seen really play football at all. And so the other thing that stood out about this is that Xavier Watts, seemingly of the draft class, has the highest approval rating because he wasn't anybody's least favorite pick. And he's also, fairly underrated by at least as far as the Locked On Falcons insiders feel like he's concerned. And, Walker has a high approval rating, the overwhelming favorite pick of the draft, but there's a couple people in there that it's like, least favorite pick, 5% of the Locked On Falcons insider. So it's interesting to me that like not everybody is sold on Jalen Walker, which is understandable because I'm not sold on Jalen Walker. We'll see on that. And, sorry to our guy, Jack Nelson, you had to get thrown under the bus. Overwhelming least favorite pick. And, I think, and we'll get into this, I think some of that is owed to him being that 7th round pick, obviously the player that people know the least about, the player that I think people have the least amount of expectations for, because I think the other 4 guys are expected to come in and start right away. Whether, that's true or not, we'll see. But like, that's the expectation for those guys. And Jack Nelson is just going to basically be buried on the, if he makes the roster, because he's not even guaranteed to make the roster at this point in time. But if he makes the roster, he's probably not going to play really much at all. He'll just be inactive most weeks. He'll have the Brandon Parker role this year as that 4th offensive tackle that will be inactive every single week. And so, I think that's part of it, as well as I think some people felt like the Falcons could have used that 7th round pick on a more useful position. And that's what we're going to get into, because let's get into what the insiders felt like the Falcons missed in this year's draft as a position of need that they did not address as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So this time of year, guys, especially after we pay our taxes, money gets a little bit more, at the front of our minds. And, when it's at the front of our minds, whether it's this time of year or any time during the calendar year, you probably, sometimes go, where did all my money go when you look at your bank account? And between dining out, online shopping, entertainment, it's easy to lose track. And that's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO that's going to give you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place, and even plan long-term goals so you stop managing your money and start building wealth. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money by using the code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNFL for half off your first year. So the final question I asked the Locked On Falcons insiders was there a position you wanted the Falcons to address and they did not? Please explain. And about 72% of the people that took this poll responded with an answer here. And so let's do the math on it. The majority of folks, almost half of them, 48%, said some combination of D tackle and nose tackle. 27% mentioned offensive line or center, specifically center. 12.5% said outside corner. 5% said wide receiver. 3% basically mentioned Jalen Ramsey. So I guess that goes in the outside corner conversation, but specifically talking about we should add Jalen Ramsey. 3% said a backup quarterback, which I thought was interesting. And Dylan Gabriel's name was dropped. And I appreciate that insider because that person is a ball knower by being a fan of Dylan Gabriel. And then about 2% said linebacker. So, I think this is probably the general consensus. I think most people went into this draft expecting the Falcons to potentially draft a nose tackle. I know I did, possibly a center as well over the offensive tackle. We know that this team probably has a little bit more faith in Ryan Nuzul at the center position than I think your average Falcon fan, and certainly your average Locked On Falcons host and or Locked On Sports Atlanta host, whether we're talking about myself or Jarvis Davis, as well as Tanitra Batiste. But we'll see what the Falcons do. It's the writing has been on the wall for quite some time, since late March, that the Falcons were planning on going into the season with Ryan Nuzul as the overwhelming favorite front runner. The question was just going to be, would he be uncontested for that starting center spot? And so far, because the Falcons haven't added a center, it seems like he's going to be uncontested in that regard. Nose tackle is interesting because the fact that the Falcons didn't add one does lend credence to the idea that, that 3-4 defensive front that we're expecting the Falcons to mainline in, and, them drafting some smaller edges, seemingly seemed to hint that that was going to be the case. But if they don't add a nose tackle, it will be interesting because the Jets under Jeff Ulbrich and Robert Saleh rarely used a nose tackle in their 4-3 stack defensive front, in their wide 9 fronts. So that will be interesting to see if the Falcons don't go about adding a nose tackle. Is that an indicator that we're going to see those similar fronts? And that's going to create some challenges for the Falcons, particularly when it comes to stopping the run, I think, this year. So we'll see on that front. But if the Falcons are waiting to just sign a veteran nose tackle, the obvious candidate out there is Foley Fatukasi, who played under Nate Ollie both in Houston last year as well as with the Jets and Jeff Ulbrich back in 2021. He also played with the Jaguars in 22 and 23. And Fatukasi is, a big, long nose tackle that can plug the run. Now, all the other quote-unquote true nose tackles out there are mostly 33 plus. I think Fatukasi turns 30 this year. But you have guys like John Jenkins and Jonathan Hankins and Linval Joseph, among others, older guys that you would assume that the Falcons would try to get someone a little bit younger, like a Foley Fatukasi, that is at least seemingly not at the very end of his career, similar to what they had last year with Eddie Goldman, although Eddie Goldman, we know, is trying to extend his career beyond 2024. But they'll be interesting to keep an eye on. Now, center is the other position that I think a lot of people are concerned about for the aforementioned reasons. And some of the options out there are David Andrews, formerly of the Patriots, an older player, some concerns about him potentially retiring due to some injuries that he's been suffering the last couple of years. So that remains to be seen if he's an option. He hasn't announced his retirement yet, but, we'll see. We'll see on that front. Another player that is, probably overlooked is Tristan Colon, who played with the Cardinals the last couple of years. And it's notable because the Falcons brought in Tristan Colon for a free agent visit, I want to say in the 2022 offseason. And then he wound up signing with the Cardinals, where he's been the last couple of years. But that's a player to keep an eye on. He's played some center, he's played some guard. So he would be an option. At one point in time, the Falcons were interested in signing him. So that would be someone to keep an eye on. Other veteran centers out there, Sam Mustipher, Nick Harris, Nick Gates, Daniel Brunskill, Cody Whitehair, another older player that has, experience with the Ryan Pace regime, the shadow regime that's secretly running the Atlanta Falcons, not Terry Fontenot. But Cody Whitehair could be retiring as well, given his age or whatever. So, I'm not expecting the Falcons to be aggressive anytime soon. I think we'll see some roster reshuffling after rookie minicamp. That has been a regular thing in the Terry Fontenot era, is that after that rookie minicamp, which this year will be May 9th through 11th, I believe, that they will usually sign one of those guys that are at the tryouts or two and maybe reshuffle a couple of things. And so I think we'll probably see some roster moves, towards the middle of May, maybe the late May, as we get through closer and closer through, OTAs and whatnot. So that's probably the timetable that if the Falcons are going to go out there and get a nose tackle, go out there and get a center, that would be the time I would guess it would be. But, it wouldn't be the first time that the Falcons waited to mid to late June or something like that to sign somebody, or July to sign somebody. So, just because if they don't sign somebody 3 weeks from now, that doesn't mean that they won't sign someone 3 months from now. You know what I'm saying? So we'll see on that front. But, I do think there's still work to be done on this roster, particularly in the trenches at the center and nose tackle position. I tend to agree with the insiders that those are the two areas of concern. I wasn't necessarily pushing for the Falcons to draft a center just because of the reasons I've stated previously on the podcast, because my concern was that you would use a premium pick on a center. That guy would sit the bench this year more than likely because, the Falcons don't have a rich history of offensive linemen nor centers being productive year one. And then my worry was if this regime does not survive this upcoming season, a new regime would come in and wouldn't necessarily stick to the plan of, oh, we drafted this center to be our long-term option. Like, the example I would use is Jared Wilson, who went off the board, I think, one pick before we took Xavier Watts. If the Falcons had drafted Jared Wilson instead, the assumption would be like, oh, he's going to be our starting center for the next decade. And for all we know, like a new regime could come in here and be like, yeah, we're good on Jared Wilson. He's going to be a backup, similar to what happened with Matt Hennessy when Arthur Smith and company took over, similar to what happened to Joe Hawley when Dan Quinn and company took over. So that was my main concern against drafting a center, that not to say you'd be throwing a pick away, but there was much greater risk that investment would only be a short-term investment that would get very little payoff, is basically what I'm saying. So, nose tackle to me was less likely to be that case because you just need beef in the middle of your D-line. So we'll see what the Falcons do at these positions, but appreciate the Locked On Falcons insiders for sharing their insights into their thoughts on the Falcons draft. Be curious what the YouTube community thinks of, what their answers to some of these questions would be. So we'll probably put out a poll for the YouTube community to weigh in on some of these questions to see if the insiders are a good composite of at least all the people that, watch Locked On Falcons and whatnot. And I don't tend to think that your average Locked On Falcons listener is like your average Falcon fan. I think they tend to be a step above if you're the type of person that listens to Locked On Falcons. So I think it's not necessarily a great representation of the entire fan base, but I think it's a great representation of, the more knowledgeable side of the Falcons fan base, because certainly you guys don't come here, for entertainment and whatnot. You just come here for all the knowledge that I'd be dropping on this podcast. So we'll see on that front. We should have a guest tomorrow. I don't know quite which one because of, we got to nail down some scheduling ones, but we'll have somebody else come on the podcast tomorrow to talk about the Falcons draft. And so that is in store for you guys coming up. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen by checking us out and subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And for your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast with the Draft Dudes. Even though the NFL draft is over, the roster moves are still yet to be made, and host Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino will make you most informed NFL fan this offseason, even more informed than your average Locked On Falcons listener. I know, such a high bar to set, but Joe and Kyle deliver consistently on the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast. Find it on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. It is all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every